Now, there are some key structures of the brain and their functions that we want to cover. In this video, we will be exploring the key structures and functions of the brain, and we should understand that the brain is a very complex organ, but that each part plays a crucial role in our behavior, our thoughts, our perceptions, and our body functions. Gaining understanding how these structures work will provide a foundation for how it impacts our daily lives. Okay, so the brain is divided into several major structures, and many of these structures have distinct functions. Now let's look and explore these structures in detail. With the cerebellum is the largest part of the brain, and it has two hemispheres, the left and right hemisphere. It also has four lobes, the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobe. The frontal lobe is located at the front of the brain, hence the name frontal, because it is in the front. It is responsible for higher cognitive activities and functions such as planning, problem solving, reasoning, making decisions, things like that. The prefrontal cortex, which is part of the frontal lobe, plays a role in personality, behavior, and executive functions. Prefrontal cortex has been called the CEO of the brain because of this higher order goal-directed behavior. As an example, consider a CEO or chief executive officer making strategic decisions for a company. The CEO is actively engaged in analyzing data and information, weighing options based on the information that he's received, and then making decisions that will drive the organization's future. Then we have the parietal lobe. This parietal lobe is positioned behind the frontal lobe, and it processes sensory information brought into the brain from sensory organs and nerves, such as touch or temperature that you feel, or even pain that you feel. The parietal lobe plays a role in spatial awareness as well as coordination. Think of maybe a chef chopping vegetables. The parietal lobe helps them coordinate different hand movements and at the same time processes tactile feedback as they're moving the knife and the vegetables to a more coordinated activity and making it more smoothly with experience. The temporal lobe is located on the sides of the brain, both the left and right hemispheres. The temporal lobes are involved in processing auditory information and also comprehending language and memory formation. The hippocampus is a critical structure for memory and is located in this temporal lobe area. Listening to a song, as an example, and remembering the lyrics involves this temporal lobe area, and this temporal lobe helps store the memory of a song and also the emotions that might be associated with it. That is why some songs can elicit strong events or memories of events quite strongly in our mind, even in an unpredictable way. Now we get to the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is in the back of our brain and is primarily responsible for visual processing. The occipital lobe interprets information from the eyes and allows us to understand colors and shapes and motion. When an artist paints a landscape, it is an example of where the occipital lobe processes visual details that enables the artist to capture the scene more accurately on the canvas, as the brain is providing feedback to what it sees on the canvas. And then we get to the cerebellum, which is located at the back of the brain, just above the spinal cord and behind it. The name cerebellum comes from Latin, meaning little brain, because it really looks like a little brain. That's what it looks like. This part of the brain is essential for motor control, balancing and coordination, and ensures smooth coordinated movements, as well as maintaining our posture or our equilibrium. As an example, a gymnast may perform many complex routine and coordinated movements in this area of the brain, and this area of the brain is heavily involved. Now we get to the brainstem. And I wanted to show you this brainstem because it is a very important part and connects the brain and the rest of the spinal cord. It is composed of three main parts: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The brainstem controls very important breathing and heart rate and wake-sleep cycles. Specifically, in the brainstem, you see the midbrain here, and it is involved in auditory and visual processing, as well as motor control. And the pons regulates breathing and relays information between both the cerebellum. Then the medulla oblongata controls the automatic functions, which is heart rate, blood pressure, and digestion. These are very important survival and automatic needs that are regulated by the brainstem. As an example, the brainstem's regulation of breathing is very critical for survival, and during deep sleep, it ensures that we continue to breathe without conscious effort or too much conscious control. it just happens. Now we get into the limbic system. The limbic system is a group of interconnected structures that are located deep inside the brain and within the brain. It really is involved in more emotion and motivation and memory-related activities. The key structures of the limbic system include the amygdala, where the hippocampus and the thalamus and the hypothalamus reside. The amygdala processes emotions, particularly fear and pleasure. The hippocampus, again, is essential for forming and retrieving memories, and learning is important in this area in the hippocampus as well. This is a very important part when we learn about learning and memory and how neurogenesis, or the birth of new neurons, can occur within the hippocampus. We will get to that in later videos. Then the thalamus relays sensory information to the appropriate areas of the brain when sensory inputs, such as when a waiter balances dishes on their hands and sends a signal to the thalamus, then to the sensory motor cortex of the brain, and these signals are sent back down to make sure that the waiter can balance those dishes without dropping them. When the hypothalamus regulates homeostatic functions, which include thirst and hunger and temperature and also circadian rhythms, basically our bodies around a 24-hour clock, this greatly benefits us because if things are not in their proper homeostatic state or balanced in a good way, it throws other parts of our brain and body off. Let's think of another real-life example, one with these parts. Let's say the amygdala. When you're experiencing a stressful event, it will trigger or release hormones which prepares the body for a flight response. When the hippocampus helps you store memory, and then the hippocampus will help you to store the memory of the event so you can recall it later. You can see how they work together. Now let's switch to another image that describes the basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia is really a group of nuclei that is located deep within the cerebral hemispheres, and they are involved in regulating voluntary motor movements and procedural learning, so basically skill learning and routine behaviors and habits, or repeated behaviors that you can engage in over and over again. Now nuclei, by the way, is just a cluster of cell bodies. As an example, when you're learning to ride a bicycle, the basal ganglia helps to develop those motor skills necessary and those procedural skills necessary, and then memory tries to recall and remember how to do it to maintain the balance and to be able to pedal smoothly on the bike while maintaining the balance on the bike. You can see how these brain structures are involved for complex behaviors when first starting to ride a bike or any other behaviors that are a bit more complex in nature. Each brain structure is specialized in a way, typically for certain functions, but they really do not work in isolation. The brain operates as an integrated network and system with different regions communicating and coordinating together to perform different complex tasks. Okay, another example would be something like language processing. This is in the primary auditory cortex, which is an excellent example of how there are different brain regions that work together when you hear someone speak. The auditory information of hearing someone speak is processed within the temporal lobes of the primary auditory cortex, as you can see here. The information is then sent to the Wernicke's area, which is responsible for language comprehension. And if you respond to that person talking to you, then the Broca's area in the frontal lobe will generate the motions for speech production, and then the motor cortex will execute the movements required for speaking. Now, one thing you should know is that the brain has a remarkable ability to adapt and reorganize itself. This is known as neural plasticity, and it really shows that the brain can compensate for an injury or even learn to acquire new skills or to form new memories. This plasticity is evidence that as we see the brain and its structural and functional changes that it undergoes while learning or adapting to new environments or recovering from brain injury, is evidence that it really does change. It is remarkable. Consider someone who is recovering from a stroke as an example, which the stroke really affected their ability to speak. But through speech therapy, a learning process which occurs where repetitive practice enables the brain and other regions of the brain that aren't so badly affected by the stroke, it starts to adapt and take over the functions of the damaged areas, which enables the stroke patient to regain their speech abilities. This is very interesting. Now, when we understand the key structures of the brain and their functions, it really provides a foundational framework for exploring more complex topics in neuroscience. Each structure really plays an important part and a unique role in our thoughts and behaviors in different body functions and their interactions, which enables the brain's capability to recover and through this, its ability to change. Now in the next video, we'll talk about neurons, which are really the building blocks of the brain, how they communicate to form an intricate network of communicating and facilitating different brain functions as well. Alright, we'll see you in the next video.